Greetings, welcome to Lunarburn Studios. This is the second part of how to dip a ceramic shell. If you need to check out part one, you can check it out right here in this link above. We're going to continue the conversation on best practices on how to do a ceramic shell and be able to capture the most detail and create the best castings we can from our wax and PLA patterns into cast metal. The first video we talked about a little bit about the materials and basic techniques that I choose to use, and we got through our first dip. In today's video, we're going to continue that and talk about the remainder of the prime coats, as well as getting into some techniques for the coarse coats and ultimately finally a seal coat. So one of the things that I forgot to mention in the last video is that you need to weigh your waxes before you start dipping. And the reason for that is that wax weight will directly correspond to the amount of metal that you need to cast, depending on whether it's aluminum, bronze, or iron. But it gives us an idea how much metal we need to melt, so we're not just randomly melting a full pot of metal when we only need a half a pot. And the other thing I showed before, or in the previous video, was a chart. Ultimately, it lays out a typical sequence for each shell. And so typically, like I like to do is, either if I have a name for a piece, or if nothing else, I'll draw out a sketch that'll remind me of what shell is, I'm dipping. Then I'd like to have, go ahead and note my wax weight. And then as I'm working my way through my dips, I also like to keep track of the date and the time. Typically for me, I'm dipping my shells within a day or two, so the date's less of an issue. But there are times you might be dipping your shells over a period of several days or a week of time, and it's just handy to know kind of what that increments are. Partly so in the future, if you cast a shape of a certain size or had a certain size core, had certain attributes to it, it would allow you to reference that back to it and know that, oh, well, that shell, because of those configurations, I might not be able to do in like a two-day shell dip. It might actually need to take me a week. If you really want to kind of get into it, it's worthwhile to make notations on that chart, as well as what's the ambient temperature of your studio space or your shell room, as the case may be, humidity level, all these, how it's going to impact the sequencing of actually getting your dips done. The more consistent you can be in your application of materials, the better castings you're going to get. Okay, so for this next dip, the second dip, we have our zircon coat. I found that both the zircon coats and the 5100 coats generate a fair bit of surface tension. And what I mean by that is that when I dip it into the slurry, it'll generate a lot of air bubbles. A lot of air will start coming back up out of the surface, and it'll take a lot more brush work to make sure that I get an even coat. A way to get around this, or to facilitate a tighter coat in between these layers, is to break that surface tension. And the way I'm going to do that is by using what I'm going to call pre-wet. It's basically a mixture of colloidal and distilled water, 50-50. I'm just going to drain it up over the surface. Getting both the inside core material you don't need this. It's not super critical. You can get away with just the extra brush work when you're doing your coats, but I like to be as efficient as possible. And by doing so, using the pre-wet, like I said, it breaks down the surface tension of the previous dip. When we go in to dip it into the actual slurry here, you'll notice that it will need almost no brushing. Okay, so as we go ahead and dip this in, for a few seconds. Those eyes always seem to catch a little air, so they'll need a little bit of extra love. Tension anyway. I'm going to brush around the teeth just to make sure I get my nice tight detail. You know, as we talked before, any kind of air bubbles that happen in between these primary coats has the potential of filling up with metal and turning into positive little balls or bubbles of metal on your casting that will need to be cleaned up. So by using the pre-wet, it really cuts down that situation and that result. And so it saves that little extra time in the metal chasing. Just letting this drain off as much as we can. You don't need to be dripping it around the studio or winding up with extra debris in the stucco bends. But yeah, you can see where very little to no brushwork, and I have a nice even coat. And then with the fine coat, I'm still using a sieve, and it's just to guarantee that no big chunks hit that fresh, wet surface. Okay, so we're ready for our third dip, which would be another fine coat, or 5100. And so with the same issue with the surface tension that we talked about previously, I'm going to coat these pieces with pre-wet. And then I'm going to let the rest of it, a combination of drain off in the bucket. I don't necessarily want to immediately jump right into the tank. I want to let at least a little bit of this to evaporate off. I don't want to necessarily add additional moisture to the tank. What little bit of moisture that's left on here is fine, but I found that I just like to let them sit off to the side for a minute or so. So using a brush to make sure I have a good adhesion of the slurry, but also to help facilitate the process of squeegeeing off some of the excess slurry back into the tank. But using the pre-wet really cuts down on the amount of air bubbles and brush work that's needed. You could get away with just straight distilled water, but you definitely want to let that evaporate off a little bit more so you're not introducing that additional moisture to the tank. But again, ideally, the best mixture is 50% distilled water, 50% colloidal. Aside from just getting less brush work and whatnot, really what we want to try to focus on is the idea that we're trying to get those first three layers to be super tight, compact, really capture the detail and be super strong. So it can withstand the turbulence of the metal as it's flowing into the molds. So this is the shell now that it has, I guess we're up to 3 coats of coarse material. You can see where it's really kind of average out the details on the patterns. Obviously we can still see the overall shape, but all those details are now under several coats of material. When we're doing these thicker coats, we can get away with actually just rolling them into the slurry, and then I like to at least hold them there and let them soak for a good 15-20 seconds. If I'm dipping a bunch of shells, like I'm going to dip a series of 3 shells right now, I'll actually let it soak, but it can sit in there for a couple of minutes without any adverse effect. And that way I'm also eliminating any kind of air bubbles and surface tension, and I get a really good bond between each layer of my slurry. So in this case, since it's the first shell, I'm just going to go ahead and pull it out, let the material, I'm just going to rest it up against the handle of the drill press. And while that starts to drain, then I'll grab the second shell and go ahead and get it into the tank. And I'm just going to let it, like I said, let it soak while I deal with letting this piece drain out. I'll work the brush over, pop any additional air bubbles, any of the slurry that's getting trapped or hung up in, like I said, the eye sockets, some of the other detail around the nose, around the teeth. And a couple of air bubbles on this coat, and some of that is not a big deal. So once we have a nice even coat, everything's kind of fairly flowed off. I'm gonna work the brush just on the inside here a little bit. Work that around, and then we'll go to the stucco bend. I'm trying to get a nice even coat, at the same time covering all my surfaces. So this piece has been sitting here. I'm going a little bit slower because I'm talking about this stuff, so they typically don't quite sit in there that long, but again, it's not that big of a deal. Let this stuff drain off, rest it, get the third shell into the tank. And so by going through this kind of routine, it's like going, getting one in the tank, one up on a board to help drain. You can kind of, you can work through the process a little bit faster. So when you do have multiple shells, and whether it's just a few or half a dozen, or there are times I'm dipping 20 or 30 shells at a time, it might take me an hour to dip all the shells. At this point with these coarser coats, they're taking about 2.5 hours to dry in between coats. And as we've talked about before, each coat's going to take a little bit longer and a little bit longer and a little bit longer. Partly because the surface area is increasing, but also the coarser coats take longer to dry than the thinner coats. Before doing one of these dips, what I like to do is just kind of lightly rub my hand over the surface to knock off any super loose material, anything that's kind of just built up. We're still going for trying to get a nice even coat in between each one. And if there's a surplus or an excess of material on the surface, it can create some delamination potential. So we just want to make sure that there's no loose material before plunging it into the tank. To help facilitate it, I'm just going to drag the brush over the surface, partly to make sure I have good adhesion. Work up and around in the skull if I can. If you have access to the core, it's helpful. But again, really I'm just more kind of squeegeeing off the excess material. We don't want the pieces to be super dry, but we don't need them to be super goopy, because ultimately that material is just going to drip off, and whether it's on the floor, it just makes, it's just an easier way to keep your studio clean, and no reason to have any additional drips or debris falling into the stucco bends as well, which would later need to be sifted out. So that is one of the things that does need to happen in between dips, is to sift out a lot of the extra debris. That way you don't have that kind of material jamming up and creating, thicker sections on your shell. On these thicker coats, I don't worry as much about whether I'm sifting or not. Just getting the material on, then filling up the entirety of the core. It's the one nice guaranteed way to make sure that you get slurry or get stucco on every surface. And then we'll put it back up on the rack. Let that dry, and that'll be ready for a seal coat. So, and then as always, in between dips, brush off any of the excess off my extra board here that I use as a shelf. Set that off to the side. Make sure you wash out your brush. If you do wind up leaving your brush or forgetting to wash it out, once it's fully dry, you can take a hammer to it and crush out all the silica out of it, so you're not throwing out your brushes all the time. But it's easier if you just go ahead and wash them out. And then again, to create the longevity of my gloves, I'll go ahead and wash my gloves, my hands and my gloves, just like I would if I was washing my hands, period. So anyway, just knock it off. I'll dry off my hands somewhat before taking off my gloves. And I've just found that this lengthens the life of the gloves to last through an entire dip cycle. And then when it's all said and done, I'm gonna go ahead and drape. And again, I don't necessarily put the plastic on it in between every dip, but I'm done for the day. I'll do the final coats tomorrow. And so that just keeps everything nice and tight, keeps evaporation of the slurry down to a minimum. And yeah, we'll give it a little time and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're ready for our final coat. And whereas we could get away with just firing it as is, ideally we want to do a final coat for a couple of different reasons. One, it just really tightens up the surface, and so we're not spreading loose silica around the studio as we're handling it, prepping it for burnout or during the pour and whatnot. But also, the final coat will make it obviously a smoother surface, but if any kind of cracking or other defects happen during the burnout, it'll be easier to examine the shell and see those anomalies so we know that we can fix them. Some of those characteristics and cracks and hairlines and different things become tougher to see if it's just this loose silica outer layer. We're going to go ahead and introduce it to the slurry. Let it soak for a few seconds and then let it drain. Now obviously you're going to need to let it drain a little bit more and really kind of the surface to stiffen up a little bit before you put it back on the drying rack. So you're not, so things aren't draining back into the open fans. Typically just lay out a piece of plastic on the floor. I'll use that as an intermediate staging point. Let any excess drain off there and let the surface of this solidify a little bit more. Positioning the open mouth or the opening in the skull towards the fans. And ready to turn on the fans here. So, oh shit. Try not to have a domino effect happening here. Everything gets a little unwieldy when they get thicker. Minimum 2 hours, ideally 4 to 6 hours, if not overnight or longer. Once they're dry, they can sit pretty much indefinitely, as long as your room doesn't heat up or the shells don't heat up. If the wax starts heating up before you're ready to burn out, it can prematurely crack your shells. So you do want to be careful at that, but otherwise they can sit for quite a while. Once they're burned out, then they actually can sit on your shelf for, years before they're actually poured. There we have it. Here's our ceramic shell for our skulls. That's my typical 10 dip shell, 3 primaries, 6 coarse, and ultimately a seal coat. As always, there might be variations and riffs on that depending on what your overall pattern is, whether it's the size, the thickness, all those kind of variations. But for the most part, probably 80% of what you do can be based off of that 10 dip shell. So we'll let these things cure on the rack, and in the upcoming videos we're going to start prepping these things to burn out, and we'll actually go through the kiln design that I use for that, and so the ultimately burning out the shells, which is a combination of dropping out the wax and vitrifying the shell so it's ready for pouring our metal of choice into them. As always, if you've gotten something useful from this video, hit the like button. If you're digging the overall content of my videos, hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Leave any additional comments below if you have some additional questions. If you would like me to clarify anything that I might have skipped over in this video. And until the next video, be creative and be safe.